In the spring of 1884, in the rugged landscape of Wyoming's Wind River Basin, while the rest of the settlers were busy cutting timber and patching roofs, a widow named Abigail Vance did something entirely different. She walked the perimeter of her small log cabin, dug shallow trenches directly against the exterior walls, and began planting hundreds of sunflower seeds. Nobody understood why. Abigail was a quiet woman. 4 years earlier, her husband Silas had ventured out during a sudden winter whiteout and never returned. Since then, it was just her 9-year-old daughter Cora, and an aging hound named Rusty. Inside her home, an old, heavy coat still hung behind the door, a silent reminder of what the cold could take. Abigail didn't complain, and she didn't ask for charity. But survival in the basin was a fragile thing, and a widow with a small child had to prepare for the brutal winters differently from a household of non-disabled men. As the summer months passed, the sunflowers grew tall and thick, creating a dense, leafy barrier nearly 3 feet deep, ringing the entire foundation up to the eaves. She didn't harvest them for seeds or oil. Instead, as autumn approached and the stalks dried into hollow, rigid tubes, Abigail carefully bound them together, lashing them tight against the outer timber of her home. Passers-by would stop their wagons to stare. Why would anyone surround their home with dead weeds? Soon, the murmurs turned into public mockery. Gideon Black, a local sheep rancher, stopped by one afternoon and asked her directly what she was aiming to achieve. Abigail just smiled faintly and kept working, offering no real explanation. Harlan Cobb, the town's most experienced carpenter, warned her loudly that the trapped moisture against the logs would rot her walls and that she was building a paradise for field mice. Jasper Trent, the local merchant, laughed and called it a delusional waste of time. Before long, her home was dubbed the Sunflower Widow's Cabin, and by late autumn, it was jokingly referred to as the biggest haystack in Wyoming. Abigail never argued back. No explanation, no reason, no apology. Abigail hadn't invented this method in a fever dream. Years ago, her mother-in-law, an immigrant from a German settlement in Colorado, had taught her this old-world technique. She used dried sunflower stalks as insulation around cabins, cellars, and smokehouses. The hollow stems and the air trapped between them functioned as a natural buffer, as the old woman used to say.
The cold hunts walls. Give it something else to find first.
The work was grueling. Abigail spent crisp autumn mornings wrestling the brittle stalks into tightly packed bundles. Her hands were blistered, her shoulders stiff from the repetitive strain. 9-year-old Cora helped carry the heavy twine, while old Rusty followed them, his nose sniffing the frosty ground. Abigail measured gaps, layered the bundles methodically, and kept a careful ledger on her table, noting the daily inside temperatures alongside her wood consumption. But the frontier doesn't easily yield to new ideas. In late November, a fierce gale swept through the basin, ripping away an entire western row of the dried stalks. "Told you so," Harlan Cobb muttered as he passed by the wreckage. Abigail didn't weep. She quietly analyzed the failure, realized the bindings were too far apart, and rebuilt the entire section stronger. When mice inevitably tried to nest in the thick layers, just as Harlan predicted, she didn't panic. She harvested wild sage and sweetgrass, packing it tightly between the sunflower stalks. The mice fled. Another night, Rusty started scratching frantically at the floorboards. He had sniffed out a hidden cold draft. Abigail tore down that section and rebuilt it entirely. Every seam mattered. Every crack mattered. A few days before winter officially hit, Amos Reed, an old, weathered trapper who knew the mountains better than any map, rode past the Vance property. He didn't laugh. He dismounted, walked slowly around the 35-inch thick encasement of dead flora, and studied the construction. He examined the air pockets, not looking for a solid barrier, but observing the resistance created by stillness rather than density. Reed stood in silence for a long time. Then, without a word of praise or a hint of mockery, he gave a slow, solemn nod, mounted his horse, and rode away. He knew what was coming. On December 8th, the wind died completely. An eerie, heavy silence fell over the Wind River Basin. Rusty refused to go outside, curling up tight beneath the iron stove. The sky turned a bruised, metallic purple. Inspecting the thick wall of bound stalks one last time, the winter wasn't just approaching, it was gathering. The great blizzard of 1884 struck on the evening of December 9th. It was an absolute monster. Temperatures plummeted by an astonishing 52 degrees Fahrenheit in just a few hours, accompanied by violent wind gusts of up to 75 miles per hour. 3 miles over, Gideon Black was battling the storm in his well-built log home. Despite burning through a mountain of firewood, the frost crept through the chinking of his walls. Drafts sliced through the room like invisible blades, and his indoor temperature barely hovered above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. He sat awake, wrapped in furs, shivering by a roaring fire that consumed double his normal wood supply. Meanwhile, inside the biggest haystack in Wyoming, it was quiet. The howling, 75 miles per hour wind battered against the outer layer of the stalks, losing its viciousness within the deep labyrinth of hollow stems and trapped air. Inside Abigail's cabin, the thermometer on the table held steady at a comfortable 60 degrees Fahrenheit. She burned her normal amount of wood. Cora lay on the rug reading a book, while old Rusty slept soundly, stretched out fully away from the fire. When the storm finally broke on the morning of December 11th, the valley was buried. Gideon Black, exhausted and freezing, made his way through the powder to check on the widow, fully expecting to find a frozen tragedy. Instead, he found smoke lazily drifting from her chimney. The outer layer of the sunflower wall was battered and torn, but the insulating core remained perfectly intact. Abigail invited him in. The warm air hit Gideon like a physical blow. He saw her ledger on the table, compared her wood usage to his own, and placed his bare hand against the inner log wall. It was warm. He looked at Abigail, who said nothing. "I was wrong," Gideon said quietly. By the time the spring thaw arrived, Gideon Black was planting sunflower seeds around his own farmhouse. Harlan Cobb, the carpenter who had warned of rot, began developing specialized wooden brackets to hold the stalks more tightly against the cabins. Jasper Trent never said another mocking word. The community dropped the old insults, and soon it was respectfully known simply as the Flower Wall. Generations later, children in the valley naturally planted sunflowers by their foundations, having forgotten how the tradition even started.